All right, welcome back to KFYR Plus. And a recent poll has revealed that 70% of Americans approve of labor unions. Now, that's the highest level of support since the 1960s. So, why is the labor movement gaining so much momentum, and could this prove pivotal for the race for the White House? Joining me to discuss is Scott Baradell, an expert on branding and trust. Welcome, Scott. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's give some historical context, Scott. What factors contributed to the decline in union support before we see this upward trend?
Well, the biggest factor far and away was globalization, which started in the 70s. In the 60s was the last time you had unions as popular as they are today. And there was a general consensus in favor of the fact that unions had helped to increase living standards in the country through negotiating for higher wages and so forth. But by the time you got to the 70s, you started having Japan and other countries competing in being able to charge lower wages, which made American companies increasingly uncompetitive. And at that point, you had the Republican Party become more pro-business, anti-union. The Democratic Party stayed pro-union. And at that point, you started to see a division and more people being opposed to unions. But by the time you got to the 90s, the Democrats were not very pro-union either, because globalization had reached the point where Bill Clinton's administration drove through NAFTA, which led to lots of low-paying jobs that were taken in other countries, taking away American jobs. And you really didn't have anyone for quite some time on either party really being very pro-union.
How have the labor unions now adapted and evolved to regain that public trust and support?
Well, the biggest factor driving it among the public is just look, I mean, we all know what's happening with inflation and the fact that it's getting harder to make a living, to buy a house. Younger generations have struggled in a way that their parents' generation did not, and they're looking for answers. And the idea, in the case of Starbucks, in the case of Amazon and others, hey, maybe we can get back some power here by negotiating together, by doing what unions have always done, and kind of building that collective strength.
So, what is the current state of labor unions? As you mentioned, with the history, they haven't been as popular as they are now since the 60s. I mean, membership has had to have been down over the last decades. What is the state of many labor unions?
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, in the 60s, the last time popularity of unions was at 70+%, like it is today, over 30% of US workers were in unions. Today, the popularity is back up to 70%, but less than 10% of American workers are in unions. So today it's more the idea of unions than the reality of people being in unions. But I think a big factor in why there's this level of popularity is really, for the first time since the 60s or earlier, you now have both political parties have come around in different ways to be pro-union. They both argue they're pro-labor and look for the union vote. In the case of Democrats, it's always things like legislation to make it easier to form unions. In the case of Republicans, it's things like stopping illegal immigration. It's things like making a point to say we're going to bring back manufacturing jobs. So it's different ways of approaching this issue, and I guess it's today on the Republican side too, also being pro-tariff. Another thing that would fight this idea of globalization and lower wages in other countries, making it impossible for people to kind of make living wages here. So you've got really a consensus among the parties that's pro-labor, just with different policies supporting it, which is another reason why when you ask Americans if they're pro-union, you've got a lot of people from both parties today saying they are.
Do you feel the changing workforce, like the demographics, the economic conditions, do you feel that has a hand in the approval of unions?
Yeah, well, certainly younger people, because in most cases, they haven't had any exposure to it. They're just looking for answers here. And it just in the same way that maybe people who were around when the Berlin Wall came down might think it's crazy to promote socialism as a
Hmm.
solution to America's problems right now. Younger generations who didn't have any experience in seeing what the Cold War was like, they face the challenges they have today, and they think, well, socialism, maybe it is a solution. Maybe it's not a dirty word anymore. In the same way, I'm not comparing unions to socialism. It's just something that's been on the outs and now is kind of coming back as something, hey, we're looking for answers here. Maybe this is an answer.
How
Let me add
has
one
the,
of
yep, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Let me add one other thing about that. I'm sorry. The other key factor is when unions really declined before, the big issue was manufacturing jobs and the idea that all these high-paying manufacturing jobs in the U.S. were being exported to places where people could be paid pennies on the compared to what they were paid here. Today, you're talking about unionization at Starbucks and places like that. You can't export a Starbucks job to China. So that's
Hmm.
something that gives the idea of unions and the idea of unions being a realistic option for getting more power to negotiate higher wages. It's another reason why it's more popular. It's a different kind of set of jobs today that are looking to unionize than did in the past.
Do you also feel, Scott, that, we've heard this over the last year or so? Listen, we need to get more youngsters in trades. College is fine, but it's way too expensive. Let's get the kids into trades that they can use. Do you feel that is contributing as well, where we've got more kids being plumbers, electricians, welders?
Absolutely. I think you've got more, women's studies majors and, t take your pick, all these kind of liberal arts majors that don't necessarily lead directly to a specific kind of job or profession, combined with the massive student debt that so many people are coming out of college with today. And there's a pretty good case to make that men and women would be better off learning a trade, start making money, don't get hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt before you even get your life started.
Hmm. How has the recent labor movements and some of the strikes that we see, such as teachers, nurses, auto workers, you saw actors and producers last year on strike, how has that impacted the public's perception?
Well, I think it's just contributed to this idea that there's momentum behind the labor movement, and as opposed to, I think that negative momentum against labor unions started early in Reagan's administration in the early 80s when you had the air traffic controllers famously declare they're
Hmm.
going to go on strike. They were federal employees, though. At the time, federal employees could strike, but Ronald Reagan fired them all. It was a huge symbolic and real act that got enormous attention, put everyone on notice that the federal policy towards unions was not the same anymore. We're not your friend. They hired a bunch of people off the street or retrained people. None of those people who were air traffic controllers who went on strike got their jobs back. That's kind of the peak of this idea of unions being on the outs. And now you've got more and more momentum and positive stories in the news about what union organizing is doing. And it's led to people saying, hey, let's follow this and see what happens.
What challenges do unions still face these days despite increased public support?
Well, I think that, in many professions, wherever you've got competition from outside the U.S., it's going to remain a challenge, maybe one that's not solvable. I don't, there's a question as to whether tariffs, as proposed by Donald Trump, can really solve those problems. Tariffs create their own problems,
Hmm.
but for jobs that can't go outside the U.S., you still got the challenges of regionally, and this has historically been the case, certain parts of the country are more prone to have union shops, and others are more right to work states in the South and elsewhere where you've never had that history of building a union culture. So even if you're competing within the U.S., you've got some regions that lean more towards unions as a solution than others, and you can find that kind of competition within the U.S. leading towards being a challenge for unions to keep up, because the idea is unions are always going to um, require and negotiate for higher wages and more benefits. And businesses like to pay less to their labor. That's just kind of how it works. That's why there's this natural tension between management
Mhm.
and labor, because that's just how it's always been.
Are the labor unions doing a better job of getting their story out to these younger workers now? Is that why they're gaining momentum?
Oh, I think so. I think so. One of our clients, I have a PR firm, is a healthcare company that works with unions, and we have a website we produce content for called laborstrong.live, and it's just telling stories of all the benefits that unions provide to workers. And I think that's just one example of many uh, websites and social media platforms that are telling this story. Because, as I said, there's a lot of people, younger people in particular, who are hurting financially, especially in the last few years with what's happened with inflation, and they're just looking for answers. And unions can really appear to be, and in many cases can be, a really good solution.
As you mentioned, 1 in 10 U.S. workers are union members, and support for unions are growing stronger by younger workers. So, the labor movement, could it prove pivotal for this election year? Could it? I think Sean Fain now says that they're backing the Democratic candidate, but uh, could we, see the labor unions, put their, I guess, their force behind Trump as well?
Yeah, I don't think that unions are going to be an important factor in the election, honestly, because I think that the support has become so balanced that I think they'll cancel each other out. For every union that's supportive of Democrat, which was the traditional ally politically of
Mhm.
unions was Democrat. Today, you've got the Border Patrol Union, you've got a lot of law enforcement unions, coal miners union, others that for reasons like, oh, if the Democrats are opposed to my profession, or they're going to cost me my job, as opposed to Republicans saying we're for coal miners. We're for these jobs that are on the outs with the Democrats. And if you add it all up and combined with the fact that many union leaders across the board like the idea of tariffs as a way of protecting union jobs and union wages, you add all that together, and Democrats simply don't have the advantage with union workers that they used to have.
How does U.S. labor union support compare to other developed countries?
Well, compared to the West, most of Western Europe and Western countries were typically compared to, I mean, between unions and between, the government regime, and the fact that the government is much more involved in terms of social safety net and social policies that ensure everything from long paternity leaves and name it, nationalized health care, all kinds of things like that. It's a very different environment from the US, where the safety net is much smaller, much more limited, the idea of limited government as it relates to social benefits. And that makes the potential role for unions to fill that much bigger, because government doesn't play nearly as big a role as it does in, say, Western Europe, in terms of providing that safety net and helping people in these kind of situations.
Scott, how vital will unions be going forward? We know what technology is looking like, and the automation that we see. Of course, we've seen it on construct or power or the car lines. You know what I'm talking about. But
Yeah.
going forward, how important is a union going to be to tell these employers, listen, we need to have bodies on the job?
I think very important. You bring up a really good point that while, since the 90s, 80s and 90s, this idea of globalization and cheap labor abroad has been the biggest threat, increasingly, and especially with AI today. You had automation that helped eliminate a lot of US manufacturing jobs. Now you have AI that could eliminate a lot of white collar jobs. So there's a lot of concern and fear about this While on the optimistic side, you can say, well, AI can help me in my job, the economy will grow, and so forth. There are a lot of jobs that are threatened. And I think that you saw with some of the criticism of Chat GPT when it was introduced last year. Hey, you guys are moving too fast here. You can't just run roughshod over the economy with technology without thinking about the impact on people. And I think a lot of state legislatures and the federal government has been thinking about this too. So unions have an opportunity to play an important role in saying, hey, we can't stop progress, but we can try to control it in such a way that it doesn't um, disrupt people's lives and workers' lives more than it has to. So I think unions have a very important role that they can play in that discussion about are we just going to let technology take over without any effort to manage it? Or are we going to have a more an approach that is more, I guess, thinking about the impact on people?
Scott, one final union question. Where is Jimmy Hoffa buried?
Isn't he buried under some football stadium or something? I don't know. I have to go back and read up and watch that Hoffa movie. But
Yeah.
my best guess is he's not going to be found.
No, I don't think so. Scott Baradell, branding expert, thanks for the expertise on unions. And it's simply amazing how all that stuff from the 60s, and you see, speaking of Hoffa, how that is coming back now for us. And is it a good thing? I think as a country, I think this country was built on the back of many unions. And I think it's great. I think that's exactly what we need. Scott, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.